Welcome to My Safety Tech Podcast with me, your host, Pete Thomas. In this episode, I'm joined by James Pallett. James and I met when James was Director of Innovation and Technology at GPE, and he gave a presentation on a digital twins project that he'd been working on. Honestly, it blew me away. James knows so much about smart buildings, and I'm really excited for this conversation. Good morning, James. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good. This is 8 o'clock in the morning. It's still, I'm not on to my third cup of coffee yet, so it's still slightly early for me.
Well, if I'm honest, I'm not through my first. So,
So-
if I sound a little dull, then that might explain why. Might liven up by the end.
No worries at all. You did a presentation on digital twins, probably I would say about 8-9 months ago that I sat through, and
Yeah.
it blew my mind. And it blew my mind for a couple of reasons. One is I felt like in health and safety, in the just general health and safety industry, that there's not always, but there's sometimes I feel like we're still on Excel spreadsheets and Microsoft files in order to store, safety data and building information. And then you come along with digital twins, and I just thought, hang on, there's a massive disconnect here from what people are doing in the sort of built environment to what we're doing over in health and safety. So I guess my first question is, can you tell me about digital twins? And then I'd love to just sort of explore how digital twins could be used to improve health and safety within a building.
Sure. Okay. Well, that's a great question. So, in its simplest form, a digital twin is a virtual replica of a physical asset. It's a accurate 3D representation of something that exists in the real world. They've been around for a number of years, about 40 odd years, primarily started by NASA, really taken off by the airline industry for Boeing. And then really the thing that's really sort of taken it off is not just Netflix and Drive to Survive. It was Formula One racing that could monitor the performance of the cars and the components of the cars as they race around the track and gather that information and feedback so that they can learn how to tune what's happening within the Formula One car itself. And in the built environment, there was a government initiative in 2011, and it was a mandate that said that all government projects should use building information modeling, or BIM, by 2016, and that created a 3D representation of the built asset you were developing. I think the stars collided. I joined GPE in 2011, and that's the same time I was head of projects. So suddenly I had this wonderful development portfolio to deliver and this government mandate. And so I was able to use that mandate. And I think I was amongst the first in the private sector to do so. So we got really good at using BIM during the construction and delivery. And we came to about 2016, 17, something like that. And what I realized was that we had these very data-rich models that contained a lot of built asset information, but they were discarded. They weren't really being used. And I thought that was a real shame. And it was always part of the plan that they evolved and developed into something else. And I was really lucky enough to work with business who are greatly admired to this day, called BIM Technologies, based in Newcastle. They took up the challenge, really, and they worked out how to connect the building management system such that you could monitor all of the equipment in a building. And once you've monitored that equipment, then you've connected it to the 3D model. Then you've also tagged the O&M information to that same piece of equipment. So you could see its performance, and you could also find the source of something if you needed to fix it.
The thing that I'm really interested in there is the fact that there was the mandate for BIM. And I remember when I did my master's back in 2018, we were doing projects on barriers to uptake of BIM, because even in 2018, there were challenges with getting people on board. And I think one of the things that resonates with me from what you've just said is we've got all of this information in BIM. We've got all of the built information, all of the O&Ms, but then people weren't maintaining the systems. And I always wondered why that was, because recently we've had obviously the Building Safety Act. So for any high-rise building, so any residential building above 18 meters, I'll keep that definition short.
Yeah.
But you've had to register what they call key building information with the regulator. BIM would have been amazing, and I've seen these even simple Power BI integrations that could have pulled all of that key building information out of BIM. But one of the challenges is that people haven't updated it since the buildings have been built in many environments. Is that something that you've seen?
Yes and no. I think the fundamental problem when it comes to delivering built assets and then maintaining them is often that the people that are choosing the system at the beginning have no connection to the people who are operating the building in perpetuity. And so the decision that gets made to use BIM, if that's the first decision that does get made, then that basic information doesn't always align with health and safety systems or operating systems or even maintenance systems afterwards. There's not yet that connect. And that's often the crucial point at which these projects can fail is a strong word, that there isn't necessarily a way of having connected them until now. And I think there are ways in which they can be connected. It's not a surprise to me that digital twins and BIM haven't necessarily answered the question in itself. It's not that the technology is wrong, it's the way that it's adopted or the problem is defined isn't really considered, I think is more of the issue.
Absolutely, I can understand that. So the developer may implement BIM at the development stage, but then who the operator is, who ultimately ends up managing that building or owning that building, may not choose to manage their entire portfolio in that way, their entire estate. And so if it doesn't fit, it's just going to sort of, I would say, collect dust, like it's an old lever arch file, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose in lots of ways it is a digital version of the paper O&M manuals that were there before. It's incredibly useful, but it was useful to a point. A lot of the issue, I think, as well, has come from this. I really hate when people apportion blame. I don't really want to do that. But one of the threats to the sort of successful adoption is often whether the occupier wants to use BIM in their fit out. And oftentimes, an occupier, the last thing they really want to do is fit out an office or residential, but they just don't want to. They don't really like engaging with the built. Well, it's a stress for them. They feel like they're going to get ripped off. They think that it's the image of the property development is appalling. Right? If it wasn't for politicians and journalists, we would be the public enemy number one, I think, and quite rightly so for in a number of instances. So, if you're faced with a decision as an occupier, do I create a virtual replica of my building? They would sort of think, what's the point? It just seems like an additional cost. And that fit out world is incredibly competitive because you're having to often bid to the lowest point because procurement teams in occupiers have dealt with trying to buy, widgets or whatever. They're not used to buying buildings. And so if you've got to value accretive decision that's going to cost you a six-figure number, and it's much easier for you to not do it than to do it. And so it's that crucial point when someone's coming in to operate a building to say, look, here, we can make this available to you. We can make this work. And that doesn't always get recognized, I don't think. That's one of the barriers because you may not have a occupier's fit out in that digital twin anyway. But when you do, and when you can, actually, I have seen it being updated and I have seen a recording of what's happening in the building. And again, you're storing information for over like 2 or 3 years that's constant. So you're getting this constant feed of what's happening within the building. And that may not always help directly with health and safety because one of the things you made in your instruction, the point you made in your instruction about health and safety is that actually I do think that there was quite a lot of software developed for health and safety quite early on. And actually there was quite a lot of adoption I've seen on the outside. You can correct me on that. But so people have got quite rigid systems that they're using anyway. And that doesn't necessarily tie in with that digital version of the building and what you've connected it with. So it's trying to find a way to take the outputs from whatever health and safety system you're using and the digital twin that you're using. Now, ideally, you could put them together so they're in one place, and that technical integration is, I think, possible, but without joining the hype. There is other ways now of storing that same information within the cloud and then playing it back to you by synthesizing the data together. And I'm going to mention for the first time, that's what AI is really doing. You're taking two disparate data sets and trying to find patterns within that point. And so I'm a bit more optimistic that this could start to come together in the near future.
Yeah, me too. I mean, I think one of the reasons why I'm really interested in this, James, is obviously now for the first time, it's almost been legislated in terms of golden thread data and under the Building Safety Act and all of the new raft of fire safety legislation, which is coming on the back of the Hackett review. And we've got BS 8644, which is the digital management of fire safety information within buildings. And it's quite interesting. You know, we go from paper copies of O&M manuals all the way through. And if you think about all of the fire safety information within buildings, you know, even if the building, I mean, I was working on PFIs. Well, PFI by their very nature aren't going to be any older than 20 years. They're all going to be within the past 20 years. And there's not many that didn't have a massive cupboard full of lever arch folders for their health and safety file and their O&Ms. The as-built information from the building. And then on top of that, like you say, you've got a siloed health and safety management system, software system. And then you've got a lot of the other sort of information to do with the construction in terms of if there have been any changes, any updates. And it's how we get all of that to tie together so that if you're a principal accountable person in law as it is now, or, you know, really just the responsible person, that you can see everything from almost like from the inception of the building all the way through its life cycle in relation to fire safety. I'm going to interrupt this for 2 seconds just to tell you about a project. Now, I worked as a safety consultant for a long time, and I know how hard it is to get good quality leads. I set up a website and got literally no hits. The counter went to like 3 people, and I was embarrassed. It was embarrassing how much money I spent on it for no one to ever find it. It was on like page 10 of Google Ads, and I spent a fortune on advertising in trade publications and never got any feedback, thousands of pounds. And then I had to spend money on making the advert. So I've set up mysafetyconsultant.io. It's a place where you, the seller, can interact directly with your customer. And everyone's welcome. If you're a fire safety consultant, a fire extinguisher technician, fire door inspector, you're welcome to advertise on My Safety Consultant. If you're a health and safety consultant, a well-being specialist, or if you're a safety software company that sells software to business owners, then you're welcome to advertise on mysafetyconsultant.io. And what's more is there's a 3-month free trial. So please give it a go. Thank you.
I think, again, it's one of those, for the right reasons, that piece of legislation and all of the regulation that you talked about is the thing, is the sort of hard stop. It's the rock and the hard place in which you're forced to do something. Because it is health and safety, it's not something which I think ultimately any director of a company can ignore. They shouldn't really be ignoring. That's, you know, that responsibility is there. I think where the disconnect is really defining the problem that you're trying to solve such that a technical answer can be found. Too often, technical answers are found offered as solutions, but they're not necessarily addressing the problem. And that's, in any innovation, in any technology, that's the wrong way around. So I think that and the people that are sort of drafting the health and safety software are not, that, you know, you come back to that blame point, where saying, well, if only I'd had this, then I could have given you that. Again, now I think that opportunity exists with these large language models that are able to scan and read PDFs or paper documents. I mean, you can convert even a dusty old row of O&M manuals into PDFs, and a large language model can read it digitally, such that it's now started to ingest, and you're creating, you know, you have in theory, you now got the ability to create a chat GPT for a building, albeit because when you're sandboxing it in that one piece of information. Now, it's only a snapshot in time, but it's also possible if a building is of a relatively large size and scale, and I think it meets that definition of what you were describing, that it has a building management system that's connected into the M&E within the building, then you can start to constantly monitor that information as well. And so all of a sudden, you're connecting what's happening in real time with all of that paper documentation. And if you can get what is called an API from your health and safety software, then you can put that into a cloud and you can store it and combine it and bring it into one Power BI together with the O&M manuals. And all of a sudden you could ask it the question about fire safety. But it's not. The key issue here is that I don't think, as far as I'm aware, anyone's really been addressing that issue and trying to solve the problem. But I think this is all possible and achievable. And I was reflecting on this yesterday. I was in discussion with a tech company that have been at the forefront of working out how to create this digital connection from the built environment and what's known as common data environments. They're really common document environments, not data, but they're there. And I was thinking about it. I was thinking, like, I started my career as a summer job in a drawing office, developing a shopping centre in Kingston upon Thames. There wasn't a lack of willingness to update drawings or to update information, because an architect, an engineer, a trade contractor had to do it in order to get sign off, in order to get the building built. So it wasn't something that people, I felt, cut corners on. You had to do it, and you had to have an accurate record of information. So it's not as though the culture doesn't exist within the built environment. It's just that it's the culture of updating it or ownership of that documentation doesn't really get transferred. And I think now, digitally, you have that chance. Right? You can move on the ownership of that digital record through the life cycle of an asset, from owner to owner, from maintenance team to maintenance team, to health and safety team to health and safety team. But it's being clear as to what problem you're trying to solve at the beginning. If that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. I just want to circle back to something that you just talked about, because this will sound very practical. Paper O&Ms to PDF. Okay.
Yeah.
We've got very theoretical in this conversation, which I love, by the way. But I know a lot of people are sitting there with paper-based O&Ms and going, how do I get those all onto PDF? And not just, anyone can sit and put them in a photocopier with some bulk uploader, but then they come out as one absolutely giant, almost unusable, unsearchable document.
Yeah.
Is there a simple solution to that I'm missing?
Yeah, there it is. Yeah. So I'm sorry, I've gone straight into the tech, and I apologize for that.
No, don't worry. Go ahead.
So LLM stands for large language model, and it's what, the best example on the market is ChatGPT. And all it's really doing is reading. It recognizes words and it understands to put one word in front of the other. Now, ChatGPT is trained on the internet, so it's a massive piece of documentation. But you can take, even if you've got, let's take an O&M manual. Let's pick doors, for example. So a joinery company has put together doors. So you should find all of the information you want to find about doors, and that, from a fire safety point of view, I'm treading out realms of expertise here. I should imagine it's extremely important.
It's a huge topic at the moment.
Yeah.
It's a huge topic.
So even if you've got a paper version from the joinery company that showed when the doors were made, you can scan it, and you can, even if you labeled it doors at building A, the large language model can read doors at building A, and it knows that that's what it is. So you've started to contain it. And so all you're doing is taking all of that paper. It's ideal if you don't box scan everything into one PDF. You can, ideally, it does take some human interaction to break it down into the individual documents that you have. But you then put collectively all of those PDFs into a large language model. And probably that's the L, the first L is probably is the most misleading piece. Because actually it should be, you could be as SLM.
Yeah.
But right, a specific language model. That's probably the best way to think about it. That you've got, that it's being trained on that building's material. So that's how you can then ask it a question, and it can come back and source where it's found the answer from. That's the piece that's changed. This is the game changer, I think.
Yeah, and I'm going to be honest, James, no one has ever said that to me. So I kind of understand what large language models are, but no one has ever said, well, look, you can put all of your building information into a large language model. And even if it helps you to search for the answer that you need, it's far better than trawling through, well, a lot of people say using SharePoint now, trawling through thousands of files on SharePoint. It'd be so much quicker, so much more efficient and more effective.
Yeah. Don't forget SharePoint, and this sounds like a shameless plug, and other than owning a few shares in it, I've got there's nothing in the game here.
Other than owning shares in it. Yeah, go on.
Well, but so SharePoint is a Microsoft product.
Yes.
Right. So Microsoft, having made that investment into OpenAI back in 2019, and I think that would go down as one of the best corporate investments in venture capital in the history, right? But by incorporating that into the Microsoft ecosystem means that even if you have got it in SharePoint, right, you can still train your co-pilot, as Microsoft call it, on a specific set of documentation. Now, the lazy answer from the project management team or the builder, actually, I've uploaded it to SharePoint. Yeah, it's there. Let's just find it. That was always the case, even when we had electric O&Ms and we'd upload them. We weren't trying to cut a corner. We were trying to make it easier to find. Like you're trying to find a Google search for your documentation. So those things are an improvement, but you're now off the shelf. You can buy from Microsoft that means of combining that information and putting it into your own language model. So that you should therefore be able to create that and make that happen.
And that's Microsoft Copilot.
Yeah. So if you now the problem at the moment is that Copilot is the licenses. I mean, they double the cost per person of using Microsoft. Almost every business it varies from around the world, but lots and lots of businesses use Microsoft as their primary business tool. We all use Word, Excel, PowerPoint, etc.
Yes.
So you pay a per person license to use that, and most businesses just accept it as the course of doing business. The Copilot element of that is then based on, it effectively doubles that as a cost per person because they can, and it should assist productivity in all sorts of ways, in all sorts of different jobs. But that it makes the ability to scan that documentation much easier. Now, what becomes important is the old analogy, garbage in, garbage out, right? So
yes,
if you've flooded that filing system with lots and lots of information, so you've kept uploading things, how does it know which is the latest one? How does it know which is the up-to-date or the accurate information? How do you even know if it is accurate? I mean, there's still a lot of human element in this. And in the same way that good artificial intelligence relies on what's called structured data, the governance of the data remains critical. It's not a lazy way of finding this information. You're still going to have to put a lot of effort into ensuring that the source information is accurate and up to date anyway, and that you've probably only got the last version stored because that's the only one you really want to go back to. You don't want it to be learning from version A when you're actually on version W. You see what I mean? So
yes,
it still needs a lot of governance to make that stuff work, but the practical application for it is there and you're able to do it. So that's the solution, I think.
Wow. And Microsoft Copilot, then I'm assuming it doesn't just come as standard, like with some 365 account, it's something that you've got to actually add on specifically.
Yeah, unfortunately you do. The other kicker at the moment is that it's only really available to large enterprise businesses. That will change. It will change over time, and a large enterprise is over 300 people, I think. So it's not always available for everybody to get to.
Yeah, okay, that's really interesting because, when you say large language model, I sort of think of a ChatGPT subscription, i.e., I didn't even know if many people know this, but ChatGPT, you can obviously just have a standard account where you type a question in, like, who's the best president of the United States, and it'll spit out an answer. But then you can also subscribe, can't you? And you can subscribe to ChatGPT 4.0 and or 3.5 or whatever, and set up an actual language model. But then when I sort of looked into that, it was all about Python coding and a lot of stuff that went well above my head. But this Microsoft Copilot just seems like such a simple way to integrate into your existing SharePoint database.
Yeah, and I am oversimplifying it, right? So it isn't necessarily there off the shelf. You're still going to need a technical interface between the two. Part of the reason why is it was talking about Python and coding, which is what the tech people need to do to make it happen behind the scenes, is because that was its first application into a wider realm. Now, what OpenAI are trying to do is to create an app store such that there could be, let's boil it down to simple terms, health and safety AI, that someone's trained it to look at those. So the basic language is in the realm of what health and safety should be, but then it's just saying, we'll get to a point where we say, just upload the files that you want here, and I'll give you a GPT back from there, if you see what I mean. So that's the premise. And I think it's, this is why it's got AI enthusiast. I will admit that, but it's got so many applications, and it's why I'm excited for the built environment, because I think it's for the first time it takes the hard yards out of how to find that piece of information that you need to do. It won't be perfect a lot of people, quite right to say, GPTs can suffer from what's called hallucinations, and that is that it will make up a word or make up a source if it doesn't necessarily know the word. So you can't treat it necessarily as gospel, but it should give you the first piece of interrogation that you need, and you will be able to train it to say, okay, show me the sources of what you've just told me. So even if you sort of look at it and it says that all of the doors on the lower ground floor should be 60-minute fire doors, and show me the doors on the lower ground floor that aren't, and you look at it and it says there are none, you think, oh, that's not right because I've physically seen it, that there's something wrong here. You've still got to question it, but at least it's the start of when somebody new is taking over building to get educated, to get up to speed as to what is there, or what is the type of door close that we've got in those things, and does that door closure comply with current legislation? There's those sorts of questions that you get the start of an answer, rather than the frustration, which is I can't find the information to start off with, so I'm going to have to search this from the beginning, and my level of risk has gone up massively because what else can you say? You just don't know.
So I've asked a couple of times, if you within this sort of health and safety environment, there's a couple of times people have said, do you use ChatGPT, which is the common name for AI that incorporates everything in some people's eyes, that AI is ChatGPT and that's it. And it's not, it's so much bigger. But it's this concept that, do you use ChatGPT to undertake risk assessments? People are like outraged. No, you can't do that. But it's like, well, so I'm a health and safety professional, and I think I know a lot, but I don't know everything. I definitely don't know everything. And I produce a risk assessment. I put it into AI. AI reviews it and says, well, you're doing a risk assessment. Let's take something really basic on manual handling. And do you realize that worldwide, the data indicates that one of the common causes of injury is X, Y, and Z related to manual handling, and you've not covered it sufficiently, or you've downplayed that likelihood or severity on the risk? I'd have to be sort of quite arrogant not to use that tool if it's going to improve safety. And that's in specific to just a general risk assessment. But then I move on to, say, fire risk assessment in a building. I can see a time, and this is all my current knowledge and understanding will allow me to see, where I'm going to undertake a fire risk assessment on a building, and I either plug some documents, sorry for the word plug, it's probably a bit simplistic, but plug some documents into a system, or I allow the system access to, or the whatever AI system I'm using access to a database of documentation. And that allows me to do a much more specific and focused fire risk assessment on the actual risks in the building. Given that the fire strategy will have already been reviewed in detail, the emergency evacuation plan will have already been reviewed in detail, like way more than I would otherwise have time on site to do.
What you've laid out there is the correct skepticism, fear of AI. And the trouble with any polarizing argument that people can take extreme ends one way or another, is going, yeah, it's great, it can write my risk assessment, my fire risk assessment for me, or my goodness me, it can write a fire risk assessment for you. That means that no one's got any input. And the reality is this, and this is where I think AI should hopefully get us to, or that it promotes the efficiency, which is you, Pete, as an experienced professional, you've learned what is good and what is bad through experience. So your experience is incredibly valuable. But as great as your experience is, you haven't experienced every building in the country or statistics from other parts of the world. You just physically couldn't get that far. But that combination of an LLM looking globally at information, or even locally at information, combining it with your own thought, gets you to a 50 to 60% start from the beginning, right? So you're not starting with a blank sheet of paper. You're starting with a very good informed first draft at the beginning, and then that refinement is where you should get it to. Now, the threat here is that should give you a greater quality of document from the beginning and give you greater bandwidth, because you should have, in theory, saved half the time. But I'm sounding very cynical at this point, but don't most risk assessments get cut and paste from previous risk assessments and then doctored anyway? So you're sort of working back from whatever the original thought was, just some iteration of that in any event.
Yeah, I know it sounds cynical, but we see it every day, and I'm sure anyone listening to this podcast will be nodding along. You're absolutely right. Yeah.
So, in many respects, we've been doing this anyway, because we're just going back from that original. Yeah, that was fine. I would just do this for the next one.
Yes.
And actually, you could argue that starting from scratch should help it, right? It should give you a better quality specific building document that you're starting to look at it and go, no, that in this building or in this tower block, there is a specific set of circumstances that we need to talk about here, that there was some fire engineered solution that really does need to be articulated, because that was, goes back from the designer's first thought that then can get inputted into what that fire risk assessment should be. Or as the building's been adapted, this is what it started off with, and this is what's happened now. And I guess that's the key point, right? Which is, as we refurbish and reuse buildings, you're taking those original thoughts and logic and putting it into something which is then updated and specific. That, I think, is the opportunity. This is where I do think AI can come in and augment good health and safety professionals working, or built environment professionals working. The lazy ones are still going to be the lazy ones. But that's a question of leadership, isn't it? That's not a question of that it's not possible to do something. It's just if someone says, I don't really care and I'm going to cut a corner, then they're going to do that. And it's not up to anybody, but if you, with a little bit of investigation, you can find out how to use this documentation in a way that's productive and helps you comply with the legislation you described at the beginning.
I said at the start of this little portion of the conversation that that this is all my current understanding of AI will allow me to see, is in terms of, I get a document that I've already started, or that is already started for me. So it's sort of like AI and myself working together on a piece of work, a report or document. How much further is there that AI can go that I'm just not capable of seeing at the moment?
I think it's important to sort of break down what AI is, because it's been thrown about a lot. So general artificial intelligence is trying to get the point at which you can replicate, get a machine to predict what might happen, right? So it's taking a basic organized set of data, and the computer will learn from that data and then start to use it in such a way that can give you an answer. And the most day-to-day use cases of AI that we see every day are things like maps on our phones, that they are permeating all the different routes that you've got possible open to you to get from A to B, and they will produce that. That is AI, right? That's using that information. Machine learning is when you're starting to predict something. So a map might show you the quickest route from A to B is up the M1, get off at junction 21, whatever it is. But it's not going to tell you that there's a car crash at junction 19 and that the best route is actually going up the A1, because it will save you time. Now, that's when you're starting to take current up-to-date data and use the knowledge of what's the shortest journey and average speed, and et cetera, to predict it. And that's where you get to machine learning. So machine learning has been around for many, many years, 25 odd years. But the advances in machine learning have really taken place over the last decade. So when you saw things that Google were able to, to beat the world's leading players at Go or at chess, yes, it's because it's trained to see the best players in the world at Go and chess, and it works out. It's permeated every opportunity about how to beat them. So you're playing against something which is not just thinking in a linear way from how to get to A to B, it's considering the 30 ways to get from A to B and calculating. So that's the machine learning part. What you see with ChatGPT is a subset of machine learning. So it's like a Russian doll, if you like. And all that's doing is taking the language and it's looking at the probability of what one word is after the next one, but it's just going through the permutations of getting that point. So it's been trained by reading all of this documentation so that it accepts that when you're talking about fire safety indoors, you would be talking about door thicknesses probably, or seals, or those sorts of things. And it knows that when you're talking about a seal, it's not talking about a mammal that's basking on the side of the ocean. It's talking about a seal in the way that you would brush seals against the edge of a door frame.
Yes.
So, but it doesn't actually understand that. It's not really understood at that point. It just knows what the next word should be. So these are the broad definitions. So you've got AI, machine learning, and generative AI. What we've talked about so far is generative AI, and that's the reading the documentation. Where I think where this goes forward is in trends. And this is why recording what's happening in a building is probably as important to start to predict what might happen and what your risk is going forwards. Now, again, I'm stepping out of my expertise in terms of risk assessments and assessing risk. But imagine a building in which you know that it's been constantly monitored. We're going back to this digital twin. You've got records of how that building's acted in operation since its inception. And ideally, you've also got inputs as to when equipment's been maintained, when it's been operated. Therefore, you've got an idea that I would have thought a well-maintained and cared for building, the basic risk will be the same as any other building, but the actual risk of something going wrong should be less because all of the door closures have been maintained, and here was the record as to when they were maintained. So all of the maintenance record is up to date. So you've got the starting point of predicting what the risk might be, and that I think is the next step. I mean, we're talking baby steps, but that to me is where the machine learning element of AI could potentially help with risk and risk assessment, I would have thought.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. I was in an FM meeting a little while back, and someone was talking about sensors that they would put on items of plant, machinery within plant rooms.
Yeah.
And what the sensors do is they've got a vibration sensor and a thermometer, really simply and quite cheaply as well.
Yeah.
And what they do is, so say for standard plant, you would take a standard maintenance frequency, probably off of like SFG 20. So say it needs an interim inspection every 6 months and an annual inspection every year, for example.
Yeah.
Well, what you could do is you can be much more proactive with that. So you can be much more proactive based on like vibration and temperature. The system can identify changes in that. And then you can go, okay, it doesn't need servicing this time, or it needs servicing earlier. So it allows you to be much more focused. And I think, that technology isn't AI. That's pretty old, to be fair. It's not even that complicated. But where it does start to get interesting is where all of that information is pulled together, and where a system automatically, I guess, analyzes and interprets that information and then tells you and puts it in really simple terms. This is due for a service now. We can tell.
Yeah. Well, it's a great point, and they're right. That basic technology has been, anybody I think that served in the military will know. I'm again slightly out of my comfort zone here, but plant and equipment on a ship, the engine vibration monitoring was basic from the beginning, right? It's because it was partly that crisis management that made you think about it. What's the risk of this engine failing when we're in the middle of an ocean? I need to assess that risk. And so you had to find a way to do that. And that's where I think vibration monitoring came from. That's the start of it. But again, this is the common misconception, right, within buildings. What you've described, what the tech world that take those vibration sensors is IoT. So it's the Internet of Things. And it was another one of those great hypes from the past that thought would solve everything. And there's a danger that AI comes back to that same point. We could be repeating this in 10 years' time. Do you remember when you said that AI would solve everything? It's done nothing. And it's sort of where we started off in BIM at the beginning of the conversation. But the common thread is, how do you bring all this together, like you said? And what's important is that if you are going to deploy those sensors, that the governance of where that sensor is and what information it's giving is absolutely critical. And this is the key sort of cautionary factor with AI. But if you can make sure that the sensor that's on that boiler in that building has to be tagged in the right way so that the computer knows that it's the sensor that's on the boiler in the building. And then that means that you're getting an output from it, so you can tag it back to that information. It goes back to that central store, which is the cloud, and that's your database, and that's your data lake. And then you can get BI and visualization that comes from that point. And what's probably more likely to happen is you could do that in a specific building, in a specific asset. The downside at the moment, the barrier to entry to making that data lake and that data storage is the expensive bit. Right? That is not cheap to do, but it is possible to do. And the cost of it will come down. The amazing thing to me is that a lot of people say the built world is slow to adopt technology. And why is that? You can beat yourself up over it. But the amazing thing to me is actually it's more that Google, Amazon, Microsoft haven't targeted the built world to sell them cloud storage. So if you work in retail or any sort of sales organization, you are a key target for buying data and clouds, and they'll sell you cloud service. So the volume take up is massive. The problem, I think, ownership of real estate is, even the largest property company in the world owns less than 1% of all real estate in the world. There aren't major players that you can target. You've got to put a lot of effort into sales to get to that point. This has probably been the barrier to the understanding how you centrally store data and information is the barrier to how you get to success and how you move on, because the built world is full of stress, it's full of bureaucracy, and those are two of the three barriers to innovation. But again, I think now we've sort of hit a time in which all of this stuff has come together, and hopefully if anyone's still listening at this point, I think this isn't rocket science to do this. It is entirely possible. What it needs is leadership from those that are responsible. And I think property companies are probably in the best position to lead, because they're ultimately the owners of those assets, and ultimately taking that risk is for the owners to start to invest in, think about, well, how can I solve essentially what is a data problem and a documentation problem such that I'm meeting my health and safety risk. If you're waiting for it from the ground up, which I think is sadly what most property owners do, from the ground, they're not going to make the investment, I don't think. And or you'll find a piece of software that's trying to answer that, and that software company is trying to make some money from that point. And then you've got system A, B, C, or D. And how do you, as a real estate professional, decide which is the best software package out there? Because everyone's got an opinion over those things. Oh, it's rubbish. It's not as good as this one. It's not as good as that one. And again, that starts to get into barriers to adoption. What I've painted is a very simplistic picture, but I think with really is leadership within property companies that I think should be asking their teams. Look, I've read about AI in the papers. I've read about all the stuff that's disrupting, asking the question, how might it help us? Right? That's really where I think property companies should be getting to today.
I do wonder if one of the barriers to uptake of, I'll say, safety initiatives, but what I really mean is everything in terms of safety software and really everything that we've talked about, but in a I guess it's in a reactive sense. And one of the interesting things there is you compared it to, say, retail. I think about my profession in terms of health and safety, and I think about how much a typical company would spend on health and safety, what their health and safety spend would be in terms of maintenance of fire safety systems within buildings, on wages for safety professionals, consultancy costs. I think, God, it must be in the millions. But no one would go and spend that on Google Ads without a very clear ROI, without a very clear click-through rate, without a very clear conversion rate. And I do wonder if with the right data that we could eventually get to that point within safety. And we could be able to sit, I could be able to sit in front of a board and say, look, these are the numbers. If we spend pounds X on this initiative, this is going to be our percentage reduction in risk. And this is going to be our ROI. This is going to be what we're going to get out of it.
Yeah. But then you're getting to the point of, I suppose this is the philosophical point, that when it comes to health and safety, the ROI shouldn't be measured in pounds and pence, should it? It should be measured in, have I reduced the risk to human life or injury in this building? And you can't really, you could put a price on that, saying like I've avoided jail or fines or whatever, but I don't think you're ever really going to get to it in that calculation.
Oh yeah. Let me just clarify. It wasn't sort of like a clear pounds and pence return, but
okay.
Let me give you an example of another, I guess what we'd call I guess it'd be a lagging indicator in terms of, lost time incidents. You go back 10 years and you'd go past a factory, and the factory would have this LED display saying, we've gone 400 days without a lost time incident, and that was their metric for measuring safety performance. By the way, I'm not saying this happened, but, imagine if there was then a sudden catastrophic incident such as a fire. There were several fatalities, and this happens very tragically. Well, then that metric just seems pointless, and there's been a lot of discussion about this in health and safety because it's very hard to measure performance. We can say, well, we haven't had this many accidents, and then all of a sudden we have this sudden catastrophic event. It's like,
yeah. And look, I think I'm still with Peter Drucker what gets measured gets managed.
Love that
So,
guy. Yes, absolutely. I guess the
so
question is, how do we measure it? But
well,
sorry,
I
I
mean,
got excited. I got excited there, James, and talked over you. But yeah, Peter Drucker, smart action plan. If you can measure it, you can improve it. I'm all over it. Carry on,
yeah,
James.
what you're measuring and the culture of what you're measuring and how you incentivize people, I think, is the different thing. Right? That right. So you've pointed to a tragic example. I often think I'll be a bit more prosaic about it. That contractors, when I was managing large portfolio development, would often boast about how long they've worked without a lost time incident. But I think that ultimately put the culture to the point of I will suppress anybody reporting a lost time incident. And can I find a way of manipulating reporting such that it doesn't become one? Because you don't want to lose that point. And I think really what you're trying to get to is the combination of both, which is to celebrate, look, here was a near miss, and this is what we learned from that near miss. And so there's almost like a celebration of saying we came really close to someone getting injured here. And we should know about this point, and we should share that point to get to better knowledge. But that's a cultural issue, not necessarily a data issue, I think. And that's where AI and technology is going to fall down, I think. It's not going to be the golden answer to that issue. You asked the question, what's the efficiency? What's the point in investing in this issue? And I think it is simply, look, property companies, like everybody else, have been used to this almost unique period of history in which we've had 15 years of low interest rates. That's led to part of the solution being, let's hire another person to help us manage this. You've kept on using human capital to try and solve this issue. And there's a finite pool of human capital. The technology part of it is that if you've invested in this in your organization, then the efficiencies should come within your organization. The danger with it is that those efficiencies also mean that you shrunk your core team down to its bare bones, and that the bandwidth that AI has given you means you're just doing twice the amount of work, but you're not actually putting any creative thought into what the actual issues are and what you're looking at. And that's probably a bigger question to look at. But to help promote productivity and efficiency is why, again, I think any company, but especially real estate companies, should be considering this in their AI strategy and how to work with it.
Yeah, absolutely, James. I think one of the, back to the Peter Drucker thing, because I do like that quote very much, to be honest, is safety culture. And it's one of those things that's very hard to measure. Everyone talks about safety culture, safety climate. And I remember years ago, I did a consultancy role, and they asked me to go and audit this company. And they said, but we want you to provide us with an evaluation of our safety culture. And in order to do that, we need you to interview the chief exec. And I just sat and thought, that's not going to work. You can't just ask the chief exec what their opinion is of safety culture and them say our safety culture is great and go, yeah, 10 out of 10,
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's one of the things at the moment in terms of safety. It's just an example of where we do need more data. And there are ways to do that in terms of, survey and looking at various aspects such as, I don't know, completion of training and the time that it takes to complete training, i.e., how engaged people are with the process. But I just think we've got a long way to go in terms of that data collection and software. Back to you said at the moment, it's a really exciting time. And I completely agree with you. I see it from the other side, from the safety side. And what I see is the changes in legislation, golden thread, all of the HRB information. Now, at the moment, that only applies to buildings that are residential and above 18 meters. Well, they've got to have 2 or more residential. I think it's 1 in Wales. Now, Wales have released their legislation a lot later than England, and they've just tweaked it ever so slightly, which just causes confusion to me. But one of the things about that legislation is that it can change at any moment with the stroke of a pen from the Secretary of State. It's been designed to change, and it's not a piece of fire safety legislation as such, which is why it's called the Building Safety Act. So it can change they could reduce it down to 11 meters. They could change it to buildings with cooling towers for Legionella. So then it could incorporate office blocks, etc. So what I sort of think is where you've got a real estate organization that has a mixed use portfolio that does have some residential, they're ultimately going to start to bring all of their buildings up to this standard, because it's easier to manage with one consistent approach throughout the portfolio, if that makes sense, rather than just, well, these are our HRBs and we manage them in this way, and this is everything else. It's like, no, actually, I think people will start to bring them all up to the same standard, and that's quite exciting.
Yeah, and I think that the other parts is where you move away just from the health and safety part of it, but I would have thought that a well-maintained, well looked after asset of any type, ultimately the running costs are lower. And that's your financial ROI, right? You are, again, we got used lazily to saying, okay, the cost of maintaining this building is a standard £2.50 on the service charge, but weren't really looking at what actually got maintained at that point. Now that £2.50 is being considered, and that if that can come down, then that should come down. But it's more that if you're operating it for efficiency relative to occupation, which is I'm getting back to the digital twin part of this, where you get to, so which is you're starting to maintain the equipment compared to actual use rather than SFG 20, you should be keeping the cost of energy down. And that saving should, share between the building owner or the occupiers. And then that has a sustainability story. So there's a lot more in this. When you bring all this together, the good practice, looking after something, should mean that it is a safer, healthier, more efficient real estate asset. And then actually what you've got is something of value. There will be no shortage of large pension funds wanting to buy that asset. And if you can transparently show that information and that data when you sell it, those assets that you don't do it with, they are going to be less in demand, and therefore the yields for those assets will drift out. And that's really hurts your bottom line. So for me, I think the ROI here is that you can build a reputation for giving not only what you say is well-maintained, well-looked after buildings, but you're giving that with evidence. That to me means that it's only likely to become more valuable. And that's what's worth against the portfolio of buildings. Even if you're a modest property company, you've got 10 buildings. Those 10 buildings that are worth another 25 bips on the yield, worth way more than 25% more. You've really increased that value compared to something else, and that's the return for me. And it's giving that efficiency to what is a pretty inefficient and dysfunctional sector of the market in real estate, because no one really understands what each other's role is or what they do, and nobody really trusts what each other does or do. And that's really been what's holding everything back. The democratization of information and the ability to measure, I think, is the opportunity as you move forwards.
Yeah, I completely agree. And actually, I've got what I do for these interviews is I've got a big A3 pad in front of me, and I write down a number of key themes and then run off them with a mind map just to give you a bit of background. And one of the things that I've written down here that I'd love to cover, but I don't know if we've got time because it's ticking on, is silo between professions.
Well, I'll give you the quick part of that, which is, and I think started off at the beginning, which is that the people who are procuring the information about a building are not the same people that are using it to operate the building. And that's why I think there's a disconnect. Or that if you've got a piece of health and safety software that's just looking at health and safety, they haven't necessarily considered what's happened before. So it's not that the whole process is siloed. I think it's the lack of common understanding. There aren't many people in that Venn diagram in the middle of who go through the life cycle of an asset that truly understand everything that goes on within that asset. If you ask someone from leasing, they don't really understand what happens with health and safety. Dare I say it, they may not really care what happens with health and safety, but that's because they haven't had to understand it. They just want to get a deal over the line which buys and sells the building. And yet you can see with sustainability that that's become a key selling feature of that building. So they've had to understand it. This comes back to a cultural point. And I think it goes back, if you really boil it down to its essence, is that if I were a true innovator in leading a large company, I think I am an innovator in the real estate industry, but you have to start off with what's the problem you're trying to solve. Define the problem, and then let's try and find the solutions going from first principles, and then you would find the answer would bring all that together.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll give you an example of something that I've learned on this journey, because I'm on a journey to improve my digital literacy. I realize that it's important within my industry. I realize that I've not received any formal training in it, in any of the health and safety or fire safety training that I've ever done up to master's degree. In fact, we covered BIM slightly, but certainly not in any technical detail. It was more in a sort of theoretical barriers to uptake. But yeah, say for instance, in health and safety, one of the key things is managing contractors, right? So working for a number of companies, you set up a contractor database, which is predominantly a health and safety database. All your contractors come in and you check their, insurances and risk assessments and method statements, and you authorize that contractor.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, over in finance, that contractor is booked onto a finance system with a database on the contractor where they authorize that contractor, authorize their POs and everything. And for the first time, after really having taken a step back and looked at what I do within an organization, I've thought, hang on, why aren't we just managing that through the finance system? It's already there. It already exists. Why do I buy a separate system to manage health and safety for contractors when all of the contractors are already on their finance system, all of their information, all of their details, and there is space there to store this information, and they can be authorized or not authorized on the finance system. And I wonder if I'm alone there in terms of health and safety and thinking like that. But
well, you might. I can't comment on that, but I do know. Again, I'm coming back to the Microsoft solution, that what you are starting to get in real estate is what Microsoft call integrated service vendors, who are credited to Microsoft. And what Microsoft have is a software system called Dynamics. And Microsoft Dynamics has 50 subsets of information. It includes things like customer relationship management, but it does include finance packages, and it's got a finance package that allows you to process all of your financing. But what you're really doing is creating a database of all of your assets and all of your suppliers. Because as a property company, you're looking at all of the rent you've got coming in and all of the costs coming out. And that's when you're basically getting your database and you're joining it up. And so at that point of risk, when you're taking on a contractor, you can start to link all of the information together in one place, in one database that you own as a property company. That then you are starting from, you're not having to repeat things. And it's just how all this hangs together. It's how you join the dots with the documentation. But again, when you've got a closed protocol finance system that's very painful to deploy, really expensive to deploy, and no one really wants to go near again, that doesn't always help, and you don't always get to the answer. So you've hit the nail on the head. There needs to be a much greater understanding of digital literacy. It's why I went back to university to study this subject, and it's why I wanted to understand it. Because until you got to the grips with what is the ecosystem and what does it do, then you can't really start to think about your strategy about how you put this together. And it's not that AI is the buzzword. AI is a solution in part of a much broader buzzword. What should really be happening is the leadership in any real estate organization should think digitally, how could I transform my business to drive efficiencies? And there are so many different ways in which you can do that. Health and safety is one of those key subsets. And all of this is really doing is trying to collect information in one central place from a variety of sources, such that whichever end of the telescope you want to look through it, you're able to find it. And that is now what's happened, is that all of this is coming together. And it's why I think, without getting on the hype cycle too much, the AI and the Copilot world is we now have the ability to put all this stuff together to come up with some compelling answers.
Absolutely. James, do you want to talk about Layout? Congratulations on your recent appointment, by the way.
Yeah, thank you. I've got an interest in AI in the built environment, and that's where I want to take the next step in my career. And Layout is a young startup company that takes a very simple problem, and this uses generative AI. So again, this is, you think, those subsets of machine learning and what it's doing, and it considers a floor plan, and it considers how many different options you have for space planning that floor plan, and it can vary from occupier to occupier. But if they want 20 desks and 10 meeting rooms, or 50 desks and no meeting rooms, does the layout fit, and can I optimize it? And that normally takes an architect and a client something between 10 and, it's just like 8 and 10 weeks to come up with the answer. Layout does that within minutes, right? So you can optimize and come up with those answers and get them signed off. So what it's doing is it's saving everybody some time and efficiency and giving you greater bandwidth to again get on and worry about the important things like health and safety and what colour should the carpet be and where do you get to. So I'm excited to join it, and wherever my next phase of my career takes me, I think it's, this is why I'm really excited and try to really get to grips with and understand data technology and AI so that I can help as many organizations as I can drive those efficiencies. And that's definitely my next step in my career.
James, thank you very much for your time this morning.
No problem. It's been a pleasure.
I really enjoyed that conversation, and I've worked with James before, so I knew James was smart. I know he knows his stuff about smart buildings and real estate, but it just amazed me how much knowledge he has on the real estate industry and really how the real estate industry can drive health and safety and what we do. Because obviously, as a health and safety professional, working in the real estate sector, if the buildings are built with this smart technology, then ultimately we end up inheriting that as safety professionals. So that was, a really interesting concept for me to consider. And the other thing that I really learned from James was just about things like Microsoft Copilot. It's amazing how much he knows about AI, machine learning, and where things are going. And, it's great to hear how much effort that he puts into, his own continuing professional development with studying at MIT, how much effort he has to go to keep up with this subject. So, yeah, it was a really, really enjoyable conversation. Thank you. If you enjoyed this episode, then please like and subscribe. It really does make a difference to the show. Thank you so much, and see you in the next episode.